China's corporate debt problem and state sector reform and
Okay.
ultimately whether state sector reform will be able to resolve the corporate debt problem, and if not fully, then to what extent. Going by the data from the BIS, China's current total debt currently stands at about 277% of GDP, which is pretty high. And what's more concerning, though, is kind of the corporate debt, and that's currently at more than 170% of GDP.
If you're comparing countries by debt, right, U.S., Japan, and
Yeah.
China all have very, very high debt.
Mm-hmm.
Even Germany has, I think either somewhere between 60 and 80%.
Mm-hmm.
So all of the large economies in the world have relatively high debt. And anyway, so they all have high public debt. But the difference between China and the others is that China and the U.S. both have high corporate debt, but in the U.S. it doesn't matter because corporations are private. So there's really no reason to lump that in with government debt. But in the case of China, because you got so many SOEs, this means that a lot of this debt that's officially carried as corporate debt at the end of the day is public debt. It is government debt. And also the banking sector is still almost 100% owned by the state. So you've got state-owned banks carrying non-performing loans that they made to state-owned companies. And then there's yet another layer when you look at China data, and that is that the SOEs have been largely corporatized, and people misunderstand that. They think, or if I say they've been privatized, people misunderstand that to mean that they think that they become private companies, and it's not exactly true. And so what happens is you have a state-owned enterprise. They corporatize the company, which means now you have a CEO and a board of directors, and you have shares. Then they privatize it, but it doesn't mean they actually sell the companies to the public. They sell shares to the public. And so there's even companies that are traded on the stock exchange which are still 41% or 51% or even more sometimes owned by the government.
Yeah.
So then it's almost a way of hiding the debt, because you're like, oh no, this isn't a government company, it's a public company. You see, it's being traded on the stock exchange. And but actually, the government's the largest shareholder, and they still get the preferential loans from the banks. And so of the non-performing loans at the banks, which are increasing steadily, by the way, like a significant percentage, probably, I don't know, maybe even 60-70% are from state-owned enterprises. Also because before, state-owned enterprises were the only ones that even had access to debt.
Yeah.
So so there was a time where almost 100% of corporate debt was basically attributable to state-owned enterprises.
In your opinion, how kind of likely is it that this whole debt problem actually destabilizes China's economy? What do you think?
One of the issues about all three scenarios, of course, is that if you make the assumption that China is actually growing at 6%, that may be a faulty assumption.
Do you think it is?
I've certainly read a lot of literature that says that it is. I think it's really odd that China is the only government in history that sets a growth target and they hit exactly that growth target every time. I mean, it's not within the range. It's literally, they set 6.7 like 3 quarters in a row, and they hit exactly 6.7.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just that's it's so strange. And then there's a lot of proxy measures that economists look at, like if your GDP is growing at X%, then you should be using X amount of oil, or you should be using X amount of labor, or this other thing, electricity should be going up because you're running your factories longer, and these other proxy measures are not increasing at rates that are commensurate with the GDP growth claim. So I don't know that I generally don't believe that it's growing at 6.7. I sort of subscribe to the theory that proxy measures say it's growing at 2.5, and the people who do the proxy measures are honest economists who say, listen, just pure numbers that we have, data that we have, we believe it's 2.5, but that's clearly not true either, and that there's a lot of things that are not figured into the proxy data, and one of them is increases in efficiency. So most of these people tend to say the real number is probably around 5%. To be able to maintain the debt and not have some sort of a financial crisis, basically China's economy has to keep growing at around 5%. Once it's everything I've read basically says if it drops below 5%, they're going to start having problems, and that's a variety of problems and a variety of reasons. But basically, let's just say the way the Chinese economy is structured, they need to maintain 5%. And most economists believe that they are just on the cusp of that 5% right now, that they're about to slip into the danger zone. As far as hard landing, soft landing goes, so the two basic theories, the hard landing, the soft landing. So I do subscribe to the hard landing theory, however, not an apocalyptic hard landing. So in other words, I believe that that basically because of this corporate debt, because of a number of other factors, because of overinflated GDP growth figures, because of this corporate debt, and now possibly accelerated by a trade war with the United States, also coupled with just insane amounts of outbound investment, and now a decrease. This is the first time that China is a larger source of FDI, let's say of outbound investment, than the amount of inbound investment that they're receiving, and so that's very telling for a number of reasons. And it also means that consumer, I don't want to say consumer, but let's say investor confidence, is low on China. It also means that China's become more difficult to do business in, more expensive, and so if you're sending more out than you're receiving, that's a problem. And a lot of that is done to create employment for people that are working in SOEs. So they actually, China's the only country in the world that, if they build a bridge in Guatemala, they send Chinese people with shovels to Guatemala to dig a bridge. I mean, it's insane. You could be in Africa or Central America, and, the country has whatever double-digit unemployment. They get a 30-40% unemployment. And you go to a Chinese construction site, and there's Chinese people doing labor, not even skilled workers, just laborers. So all these things together, I subscribe to generally the hard landing scenario, but not an apocalyptic hard landing. I think that China will experience a hard landing. Its GDP growth is going to slow down tremendously. I think the government, but it'll be just like the U.S. I mean, if you look at something like the global financial crisis, and you say, if the global financial crisis had happened to, I don't know, some country other than the U.S. And China, had been hit by the same level of crisis, right? That country would have just collapsed and disappeared off the map. But that's not going to happen in China. China's got a lot of options. And the other interesting thing about economics seems to be that when you have money in the bank, no matter what your debts are, if you have a certain amount of money in the bank, it seems like you can kind of move it around, and put a stopper here and put a patch there. It's not exactly solving the problem, but that you can manipulate it. And China's still, they've spent most of they had almost 4 trillion of reserves and foreign currency reserves. And most economists believe they had to keep the number above 3, that they needed 3 to be able to function. Well, they've done stimulus packages and used up most of that money. So now they're down to something like 3.1, I think between 3.1 and 3.3 right now. I can't remember.
I think actually there was an article that I read that last month the reserves actually dipped below 3.
Did it drop below 3 now? Okay. Yeah, that's possible. Yeah, because it dropped all the way down, and a lot of it had to do with the U.S. Fed rate. Yeah. So, because I just, what happened was the last paper I filed was when the Fed rate hit, and then all the predictions associated with that. And I haven't followed up on it because I've had to do a lot of Donald Trump papers, because I write for a Chinese think tank, so I have to sort of go with the biggest things that are going on that don't involve Taiwan. But so if it dropped below 3, so you see that, so you can see, okay, well, if they're using up their foreign currency reserves and they're getting into the danger zone, right? And a lot of economists just believe they shouldn't allow it to drop below 3. So short answer, I believe that there will be a hard landing, but I don't think it's going to be apocalyptic. I don't think there's going to be riots in the street, food riots or something. But I definitely think that they're going to have a hard landing.
Yeah, that's quite concerning, actually. So kind of moving away from that a little, I was wondering whether you could kind of talk about China's state sector and whether you could shed some light on the role it's played in China's economy, both historically and even now.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Well, okay. So obviously, before 1978, the state sector was essentially the only game in town, right? It's very interesting though, because there actually was a certain amount of private sector economic activity, even I don't know as recently as long ago as 1949, but certainly during the 50s there was already some. There was some, but it was very, 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 very limited. And if one of my students wrote on an exam that 100% of the economy was owned by the state sector, I wouldn't mark that answer down. But so you had basically essentially everything being run by the state. And then 1978, then you start with the economic reforms.
Yeah.
And so one of the first things that became privatized was the production of rice. And so they began allowing farmers to, rather than do collective rice cultivation, that each family was kind of doing their own rice, and they had to meet a quota, and they paid the quota to the state, and then they could keep the surplus. And then little by little, the township and village enterprises. So you have the POEs are the big federal ones, and then you have the SOEs are the big federal ones. And then you have at the local level, you have township and village enterprises. And then those enterprises they were the first ones where the government said, listen, you can, the person who runs it, the manager, can now act as an owner. They didn't necessarily give it to him, but they sort of allowed him to act as an owner, act as an entrepreneur, and he got to keep a portion of the profits. And so instantly they began operating more efficiently. They decreased the numbers of workers, and they just in general just increased efficiency because they wanted to make profits. And then of course the townships and villages got to keep some of this money as well. And so that's how the whole reforms, that's how they started, and then they just kept getting bigger. And then this went on until the first free trade area, special economic zone, was opened in Shenzhen, Guangdong. The first one, I believe it's around 1981 or 83. They opened the first one, and then the companies that were in the zone were private companies. And what happened was, because the township, this is really interesting, because the township and village enterprises were the first ones to be sort of corporatized or privatized, or the first ones that were allowed to function as real companies, they were also the ones that were in the best position to begin dealing with the world, because basically China, had by having this total socialist system, they had basically prevented the world economy from touching China. So when they opened up these special economic zones, they put some Chinese companies in there, which were now allowed to deal with the outside world. And the companies that were in the best position to do that were township and village enterprises. So I find that really interesting, that there may have been some small, company making steel or something in a village in the middle of nowhere, and suddenly that's the company that's now dealing with Japan and Germany and whoever else was coming to invest. So then that continues through the 70s, until today even, but that continues through the 80s, and then eventually they have the policy called letting go of the small and grasping the big. And so what happens there is they start privatizing, they corporatize the SOEs, and they start privatizing them. Some of them they actually sell off. Some of them they actually sold to the management or to, I'm fairly certain that in some cases the townships and villages may actually have bought the SOE or they owned it. They became the actual owners, shareholders. Okay. But now you have shareholders, you have a board of directors. They have two layers of management in the company, because you have the party people, and then you have the actual CEOs and CFOs and things. And in some cases, those begin to merge. And when you go into companies like in the 80s and things, it's starting to become less and less common that you walk into a company and there's a guy wearing, an army uniform, running the company. Yeah. it may be a guy in a suit, and until 3 weeks ago he was in the army, but because he still has political connections, but he wouldn't be wearing a uniform anymore, and he wouldn't directly be employed by the government, and so that happens all through the 80s and into the 90s, and then in the 90s, I believe around 92, 94, the first private property laws come into existence in China, and also the first laws governing POEs, privately owned enterprises. Mm-hmm. And so the POEs existed, arguably, definitely during the 80s, possibly even during the 70s. It's arguable that you could say that they were POEs, but they didn't become part of law. They weren't legal entities, I guess, until the early 90s. And then there's the famous, I don't remember the year exactly, but one of the 5-year plans in the 90s or early 2000s for the first time mentions the POEs, and they have in China the three represents, that the China represents the whatever it is, the agricultural workers, the factory workers, and something else, party members, whatever it is, and then they just added a fourth one, and they added, and the party represents the entrepreneurs. Mm-hmm. And once that happened, then entrepreneurs were allowed to join the party, because they weren't allowed to before, because it was anti-communist, anti-revolutionary to want to be a business owner. Mm-hmm. So then they allowed entrepreneurs to join the party, and then today it's at a point that entrepreneurs are sort of encouraged to join the party, and that in a lot of the 5-year plans and a lot of the government speeches and things, there is an underlying theme that if you're a good communist, if you're a good member of the party and you serve the state, the best way you could serve the state is by helping the state to get rich. Mm-hmm. And the best way to help the state get rich is, to form a company and do really well with it. It's kind of your patriotic duty to do that. So now there's different figures on what percentage of GDP is attributable to SOEs. Mm-hmm. As far as employment goes, I think the number is around 30%. But again, you can check it. But when you check it, just be really, really careful what you're looking at, because there's what the Chinese government calls SOEs are really only companies that are 100% owned by the government. Yeah. And a lot of times they also don't include the township and village enterprises in the SOE figures. And then the other thing is that you really need to look at also companies that are partially owned by the government. So I think in one of my papers, if I'm not mistaken, I wanted to say that something like the official figure is like 30 some odd percent is attributable to SOEs, but if you take companies that are partially owned by the government, I think it still runs like 60% of GDP. But don't quote me on that number. But anyway, the number, I just remember it being a lot higher.
Yeah. Oh, okay. And now, going forward with this whole reform process now, what are some of the key challenges you think?
Well, there's a huge issue. The main issue with the Chinese economy, or one of the main issues with the Chinese economy, is that as countries develop, first you do primary industry, and everybody's hunting and gathering, and the next step is everybody's farming, and then slowly you move into industry, and for every person you take away from farming and put into industry, it increases your GDP by 4 times, and so that's why all these countries have this massive economic growth during their industrialization period, right? They all turn in double-digit numbers, and they're the next great economic wonder, including China, including Vietnam, including the U.S., but 100 years ago. So then what happens at some point, you max out what you can do in production, and then you need to move into tertiary industry. And again, a factory worker, let's say a farmer contributes $1 to GDP. Move him to a factory, he now contributes $4 to GDP. Move him to an advertising firm on Madison Avenue, and he now contributes $150,000 to GDP. So, so that's how countries like the U.S. or Germany or whatever how they become really, really wealthy, or UK. that's how they become really wealthy, is that, you start moving people to this tertiary sector. And during that secondary sector phase, that's where you have mom and dad worked in a factory. Now they have a lot of disposable income that they never had before when they were farmers. They send their kid to university, and then the kid will grow up and they'll go work in the tertiary sector. And, and in the US, UK, Canada, whatever, you saw this, like, during the 60s, 70s, 80s, that they moved away from production and into tertiary sectors. So the problem with China is that the tertiary sector is not growing fast enough. So right now they're graduating more than 7 million kids per year from university. And there's not enough tertiary sector jobs for them to go to. And in fact, I remember one of my papers, I think that in a given year they'd created something like 250,000 new tertiary sector jobs, something like this. And when I say tertiary sector, I mean the legitimate tertiary sector that a college graduate would want to work in, because technically haircutting is also a tertiary sector, but that's not what kids want to do when they graduate university. So the problem with the SOE reform is that if you start reforming the SOEs any further from where they are now, if you start laying off workers to make the companies more efficient, there's no place for these workers to go. The other problem is that China has priced themselves out of, or is on the cusp of pricing themselves out of doing production. So they've done what they could to keep the currency low and keep the wages low until now. But now you're at a point that while China's the number 2 economic power in the world, and yet the average income is a quarter, or let's say a third, of the average income in Greece. So people in Greece and Portugal earn more than Chinese people by magnitude, 200, 300, 250%, let's say. And that makes no sense. That makes absolutely no sense. And you look at Western Europe, and Germany has the best economy. Workers also earn more in Germany, but you go to like sort of everything west of Germany, salaries are let's say in line. I'm not going to say that they all are the same, but Holland, Belgium, whatever. I mean, like you within some reasonable range. And then you get to China, you go, oh, this is the second economic power, and people are earning $8,000 a year. This is madness, right? So, and the Chinese people are becoming aware of that, and they don't like being poor, and they have TV and they have internet, even though it's blocked, and they have all these things, and they're all traveling abroad now, and I'm sure that it occurs to them when they travel abroad and they go to the UK and they go, wow, a cup of coffee in the UK is $6. That's my daily weight, or whatever it is, half a day. So as far as what I see moving forward is that China's in a real bind, that they need to streamline the SOEs further and cut workers, but they can't because it'll produce unemployment. If they release these workers to the private sector, they've already priced themselves out. So even though they're only earning $8,000 a year, I'm talking to you today. I'm sitting in Cambodia where a factory worker earns $120 a month. Right. So China's already charging, let's say, 2,500 RMB a month. To 2,500 to 3,500 per month. So you're looking at how much is that? Like $400. Let's say $400 for a factory worker. So they're now charging 2.5 times what Cambodia charges. They're charging 2.5 times what Vietnam charges, and Vietnam has extremely hardworking workers. They're charging double what Indonesia charges, and Indonesia has a highly educated workforce. And so little by little, they're pricing themselves out. And so they can't, if they raise the price, if they raise the wages for the workers, they're going to be completely out. If they release more of these workers from the SOEs to the private sector, they can't afford to make a living, and there's not enough places for them to work. So they're really in a bind that they can't reform the SOEs very much more than what they have. And so then what do you do? And then the non-performing loans are mounting up. Well, what are you going to do? Stop loaning money to the SOEs? Well, if you stop loaning money, they can't operate because they're operating essentially at a loss. And one of the things that makes Chinese products so competitive on world markets is labor costs are preposterously low, and B, the countries are receiving subsidies from the government, which again is a violation of all free trade agreements. I mean, it's generally one of the things, whether you're WTO, whatever it is, TPP, generally there's an agreement that you don't have government subsidies because it's not fair to the other countries that are competing, and that's effectively what you have in China. Mm-hmm. So they're really in a bind that they need to reform, but I don't see how they can, because if they stop loaning money to the SOEs are going to fail. If they streamline the SOEs and fire the people are just going to be unemployed. Plus, you've got a bit of a welfare state situation where you say, is it better to make people unemployed and pay them redundancy payments, or, keep them employed at the SOE? At least the country is getting strategic benefits from having the SOEs. The people are producing, they are working, and then you're paying them. That's probably better than having them sit at home on the dole. Mm-hmm. Not that China has much of a dole. China's SOEs have played a tremendous strategic role, mm-hmm. And will continue to do so. So the country does benefit from the SOEs. So again, it's not as simple as saying, well, the SOEs are unprofitable and there's too many workers, so you should get rid of them. Well, it's not that simple either, because if you look at all these infrastructure projects that are being done around the world, yeah, a lot of them are being done by Chinese SOEs, and there's yet another, it's like this other level that a lot of people miss. So you have Chinese FDI, mm-hmm. then you have trade. Mm-hmm. And those are the two things people look at: investment and trade. Like, they go to Africa and they invested this much and they trade this much, mm-hmm. and people look at that as being their economic activity. No, there's another level, and that is China goes to an international organization such as the World Bank, mm-hmm. and says, "Hey, I want to help Nigeria build a railroad," mm-hmm. or the World Bank says, we're willing to fund a railroad in Nigeria. We're taking bids. So they take bids from Japan and China as the world's two major, railroad builders. China has the cheapest bid, so China wins the bid, and then China builds a railroad in Nigeria. Well, that money comes from the World Bank, for example. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't actually count as investment by China. Neither is it really trade with China. However, it benefits China's GDP. And that company that builds that railroad may very well be an SOE. Mm-hmm. And whether it is or it isn't, it'll be highly connected to the government. And if you follow the chain, all the steps leading to that company, they will largely be state-owned companies. And in fact, even the banks, because I would assume that when the World Bank makes this money available, that they then deposit it into a state-owned bank, and the state-owned bank manages the all the contracts and subcontracts and things like that that'll be given out, and this will all be done at the state level. So, like, the steel that's used for the railroad and the coal and maybe the machinery and these things might all come from state-owned enterprises. So even if the company that's physically building the railroad is a POE, the state is benefiting tremendously from this activity.
Okay. Oh, that's really interesting, actually. Mm.
It's so many levels. When you start looking at China, there's just so many. I hate to use that onion example because it's overused, but it's things are never as simple as they seem.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, and just what I tell my students all the time is this. It's kind of funny. There's two rules that I have, and they're diametrically opposed. And one of them is, the simplest answer is usually the correct answer. Mm-hmm. Most things in life just happen. There's no conspiracies. Things just it just happened. Yeah. However, there's another rule of thumb, which is this: Chinese economists are not dumb. Yeah. Nobody's economists are dumb. And so when you see a country do something that looks like a really stupid move on the outside, yeah, you get to take a deep breath and go, you know what? They got really smart people working in there with a lot of experience. There must be more to this story than, than they just did something dumb. There's got to be a lot more going on here.
Yeah. Okay. And now kind of moving on to like the last section. You obviously mentioned the challenges. What can be done? What are your thoughts on current reforms? How effective do you think they will be going forward. I think especially in recent years, there's been many sort of SOE reform pilots. We've seen a push for consolidation. There's establishment of asset management companies again. There's a lot of push for mixed ownership structures or partial privatization. What is your opinion on current reform progress?
Well, straight away, I think every economist that I've ever read agrees that China absolutely has to liberalize their financial sector.
Yeah.
At least the financial sector is going to have to be liberalized. It's going to have to be, privatized. Interesting that you mentioned the mixed ownership, because the mixed ownership is exactly one of those reforms that in many ways gives the appearance of reform.
Yeah.
Without actually reforming, because then at the end of the day, the company may still be controlled by the government.
Mm-hmm.
And also, the mixed ownership a lot of times means that the government is recognizing the fact that a private manager may be better suited to earning a profit or running the business better, but then they can't let go of the business for some reason. So how effective these reforms will be? Well, if you hire a private manager, but then you don't let him manage the company, it's not really going to help anything. If you completely privatized, then that company is going to wind up at the end of the queue when they're applying to buy raw materials, or when they're applying for credit, which are still under the control of the state. If they privatize, they start allowing private lending, which, it's happening slowly. There's movements in the financial industry, and they're beginning to allow companies to do things that they never did before. And that I believe it's Taobao that's poised to become the world's largest bank.
Mm-hmm.
If it's approved. So if a move like that happens, in a way, it's going to be the Wild West. You're going to see just this absolute explosion of private companies being able to borrow money. And you may see people leaving POEs. I think that's another thing, too, because I've done a lot of research on, why people are at POEs. And the reason people are, no matter what people are doing, the reason they're doing it is because they can't think of anything better. And if you go to Norway or Sweden or Japan, the people are not very entrepreneurial, and one of the reasons why is because if you work in Japan and you have employment for life, and you're guaranteed your bonuses and your weekends off, it's a big risk to go open a company. And if you live in Norway and you've got 3 years, what do you call it in English? Schwangerschafts. When the woman is pregnant, she can take off for 3 years, or her husband can take off for 1.5 years.
Okay, yeah.
You don't have that when you have your own company.
Yeah.
So those people would be risking a lot by leaving. So in China right now, so what might happen is there might be people that are at an SOE and they're unhappy with their job, or they're unhappy with their situation,
Yeah.
or they feel like they're being underutilized.
Mm-hmm.
But if they were to leave and start their own company, it's just too difficult. So now if you suddenly privatize or make some sort of private banking available to people, and you don't have to be an SOE to borrow now.
Mm-hmm.
You could be a small company and you could borrow. You might see people leaving SOEs because suddenly there's other alternatives. They're going to leave the SOE, they're going to go start their own little company.
Mm-hmm.
And then when they start their own little company, they'll call that SOE and invite their friends to come work for them.
Yeah.
And so this is the natural, like if you take Britain or Germany, countries where, let's say, the rail or the post or certain industries were private even into the 20th century, even into the end of the 20th century. There were, Germany, for example, privatized the telephone company for the first time in the 90s, and that's what happens. So you start out, you have this bloated company. Mm-hmm. You cut some people to make it more efficient, but also what happens is opportunities open up now in the private sector, and the people leave voluntarily, and then it shakes out. Mm-hmm. So that may happen in China if China liberalizes their banking sector in particular. And they make the general climate more conducive to people starting POEs. That may help to alleviate a lot of the overemployment at SOEs. And as employees leave, they could just reorganize. The SOEs could just reorganize their work charts, their what do you call it, the company work charts, flow charts. Okay, we're no longer a company that has 100 employees. We're now a company that has 80 employees, and this is what the 80 employees do. And then little by little, those people leave, and the privatization kind of happens, and the reduction happens as a natural consequence. And also that if the SOEs if they wean the SOEs off the government subsidies, they're forced then to operate more efficiently and more profitably.
Mm-hmm. And they have been sort of working on that, I think.
Right?
So do you think they are on the right track? Do you think there is sort of anything else that could be done?
No, I think it's extremely difficult, and I think that it is not simple. And I think that one of the biggest issues, again, for China is that their tertiary sector is simply not big enough to take all the college graduates, or to take all the people that you would need to leave the SOEs. And the other issue is that I don't know that China wants it to privatize all the SOEs, because they're getting a tremendous strategic advantage from the SOEs. For example, the OBOR, the One Belt One Road project basically couldn't exist, without the SOEs, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that's something to think about too, is that I don't know that they can fully privatize or fully reform, and I don't know that they want to, and I don't know that they should. Mm-hmm. But then the question is, so if you don't want to, or if you can't, or if you don't, then the question is, how do you keep going? Because your non-performing loans are increasing at a shocking rate.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I don't have a good answer as far as, is it enough? Is it fast enough? I don't know. Certainly they appear to be moving in that direction. The question is, can they or should they even be committed to those reforms? And again, it's one of those things that looks so simple on the outside. They should just privatize all the SOEs. Well, it's not that simple.
That's true. Do you see that whole thing changing over time, though? About the tertiary sector and the reliance on SOEs.
One would assume, but it's all a Teufelskreis. What do you call it in English? Like there's a what do you call that in English? A circle, like a self-perpetuating circle. Like, in other words, if people earn $8,000 a year, there's only so much that your tertiary sector can do.
Yeah.
Right? Like, if you opened all the same businesses in Beijing or Shanghai right now that you have in London, right? They'd be closed in a week because the population only has $8,000 to spend.
Yeah.
They can't support that type of tertiary sector. Like, for example, real estate turnover. Commercial real estate turnover in Shanghai is preposterously high. My unofficial observation of the street that I live in is 70% per year. 70% of businesses open and close within 1 year. Okay. And so I asked an entrepreneur, I go, why is that? I go, I see people opening the stupidest business. Like, the day it opens, you look at it and go, well, that's not going to survive.
Yeah.
This guy opened a cafe that had 2 tables. You go, how's that going to work? And surprise, 6 weeks later, he's out of business. Somebody opened there was a corner that went through 3 or 4 different shops. And the 4th one was a pet store. I'm like, what are you opening a pet store? What are you thinking about? And then another one, this is my favorite one, was somebody opened like a window, like a stall that you walk up to the window and you order a coffee and you take it with you. Yeah. And it was coffee. Yeah. And it costs the same as Starbucks. And I'm like, well, I pay that money at Starbucks because I sit there in the air conditioning or the heating, and I use the Wi-Fi, and I enjoy being there. I'm not going to walk up to a window and buy a coffee for that price and walk away with it. And it was terrible. And again, it closed in 6 weeks. So I asked this entrepreneur, I go, why do these people open these idiotic businesses? Don't they do research? And she goes, no. She goes, Chinese entrepreneurs don't pay for market research. Yeah. And then I started looking at it. There's a lot of things they don't pay for, and they're all tertiary sector things, like even marketing and things like that they'll get their friend or an art student or something to make their advertising for them rather than paying a company.
Yeah.
So they need to increase the size of the tertiary sector. The tertiary sector can only increase so people have more money to spend in the tertiary sector. People only have more money if they work in the tertiary sector. So I mean, it's just making this crazy. We used to play this game called Pick Up Say, oh, Jenga. Oh yeah, you would know Jenga. It's like Jenga. You're like, oh, I want to pull this one. I want to pull this one block out. Well, if you pull that block out, all the other blocks fall down.
Yeah. Yeah, but surely also, the attitudes towards things like that, don't they sort of evolve over time as well?
Yeah, of course. Obviously, all of this, every situation I'm describing existed in the U.S. 100 years ago. But really, I was at a round table of entrepreneurs when I was home, and they were facing the same problems. I mean, it's the same problems. It's just on a different level. In London, England's facing the same problems. If I were to go to England, and again, England's outside of my research area, but I'm willing to bet money if I went to England and I went into any place that was not London, and I asked people, I go, what's the problem with your economy here? They're going to tell me, oh, there's no jobs, so the young people leave. Or, a disproportionate percentage of the country's total young people are in London because that's where the opportunities are. But then rents are really high in London. And then it's hard to make a living, and I mean, it's going to be the same. It's the same. It's the same argument that you hear in Shanghai or Beijing. So the whole world is facing this, and then the whole world works through it. The difference is, though, that because China has a command economy, it's very difficult to predict whether or not these problems will just work themselves out as they did in England or France or Germany, countries that developed, essentially through a free market. That's the problem because you could do all the mathematical modeling you want, but at some point you have to say, but of course the government could just wave a magic wand and make this or that or the other thing happen.